that's kind of, well, I'll be back to StatCan repeatedly. But what do custodians want in general? So, and a custodian is trying to leverage the value of data by making research with it possible. So the custodian is trying to get the most out of the data they have in their collection. They're also hoping that they are well aligned with their researchers. So they need to know a bit about the goals and principles of their researchers, and they need to choose to work with researchers who support their particular aims and research principles. They're also trying to leverage the value of researchers by giving them higher quality data that has already been collected and has been, other researchers have kicked the tires in many cases, and that is collected by people who are really good at collecting, so that then the analysts can do their thing on the best possible data and on a huge variety of data, as the Portage network was, as we were talking about earlier. It's also, we do want a consistency of approach with other custodians, in part because it's easier for people to move around and do research from different sources if the general processes are the same, and in part because despite everybody's best efforts, a source may turn up in 2 different places, and we want it to be treated the same way out of each of those sources, and I'll get into a little bit more into why that's important later on. So when they're collecting a source, they also want to know how other people are using it, both from an aims and principles point of view, but also if somebody is using a particular confidentiality technique, the custodian taking in the data needs to know that to make sure that they're not undoing the work of some other custodian or some other researcher. So that's consistency. And this is really important, and this is the practical reason, we'll touch upon this again. They need to maintain the trust of the data providers by protecting confidentiality. I mean, particularly in the case of surveys, we're asking people nicely to give us their data. If they don't trust that their sensitive variables will be kept safe, they may not say yes, or they may say yes this time and not next time. And even in the case of administrative data, we want people to be honest when they're providing data to administrators, and there are usually ways to revoke your data, and we don't want people to feel that they need to do that. We want to maintain that trust so that the data is complete, and so that we can continue to carry out our mission of informing Canadians and collecting the best data we can. Yeah, so this is a UN fundamental principle of official statistics. And this is, again, kind of the dividing line between StatCan and all these entities with business uses. And I mean, you could lump in organizations like CIHI and Portage. So these statistical agencies, you can't really have too many missions, and the mission of a statistical agency has to be quite clear that it is exclusively for statistical use. And this is enshrined in these fundamental principles of official statistics. So what does that mean practically is that they can bring in outside collaborators, but they need to make quite sure that both those collaborators and everybody downstream is using it for statistical purposes. So that's the major dividing line between the original purpose of a lot of this administrative data anyway, which is for making sure that payments are made, making sure that systems work, and the statistical aspect. And having a separate statistical agency whose job is solely to do things for statistical purposes is a way to maintain that trust, a way to maintain some notion of separation from other agencies that are using this data to follow up on people's taxes or enforce the law, is that this data, once it gets into StatCan, is strictly for research purposes.
But do you sell it to business for research, like pharma or?
Nope. There is, so this is, I'm going to ponder how to outline that. There are ways for an outside agency to collaborate with StatCan, and usually it's other federal departments. And researchers can have associations with business as well. If they come into an RDC, if they're doing research out of a university and they're being sponsored by an outside party. But then the researcher is oathed in and is a deemed employee, and we'll get into what that means. And their results can go out to the business sponsor or to the sponsoring agency. Amanda, you're going to clarify that?
I can just clarify. So I work with Statistics Canada. We work on, I created a data service center. We used to be called the regional office. So basically he works at headquarters and he's the number cruncher.
Yeah.
And my team, we are the frontline workers to the Canadian public. That's why I'm here, because I'm that other face. So if you were, for example, a business and you were doing research, you could contact me, you could contact my team and say, Amanda, I'm interested in getting some health data, to use an example, and I want to know ABC from specific administrative data. So we have all this information, it's already gone through what you talked about, the privacy, confidentiality, but perhaps you want to customize. So if you want customized data, we have it, and as long as two things are met, confidentiality and quality, we will disseminate it. But there may be a cost involved. Why? Because we are what's called cost recovery. We're recovering the costs for the Canadian public because you really don't want that business, you don't want your tax dollars going to that business. You have to pay Amanda to do all the work, so the model is cost recovery. So if that's your question, then yes. I'm glad you asked the question because my team, that's what we do every single day is we're working for the Canadian public. For a lot of the data are free, and if it's not on the website, you can contact me, contact my team. We may be able to find you that data for free. We can't put everything on our website, or we could give you a cost estimate, and you could say, you know, it costs $300. It's going to take 2 weeks to produce it, or 3 weeks, depending on how busy the analysts are, and we can provide that to you. So, but again, confidentiality and quality, always important.
Yeah, and from the confidentiality technical point of view, what you're getting when you contact the service center and you request some data, you're going to get confidentialized aggregates similar to what somebody could spend a bunch of time in the RDC and produce, probably generally a fairly specific and well-defined thing, but it will have gone through the confidentiality vetting process, and somebody will have to have certified that that data is good to go out. And it's on an even playing field too. A journalist under our media policy can contact StatCan and get custom statistics to help them complete a story, to illuminate something going on in the news. And just regular old Canadian can go in and either use online tools, online tabulations, or effectively hire the data service center to create, again, this confidentialized output from the microdata. So nobody gets the source microdata. You get an output that is an estimate or a model parameter or whatever it is you need, built by professionals inside StatCan, or through the research data center. Somebody effectively becomes an employee and subject to the rules around employees and works with an analyst to create a product that then they can safely get out and that meets all of the confidentiality requirements. So maybe a long answer to a simple question, but we are here for all Canadians, be they businesses, individuals, journalists, politicians, whoever needs the information. We're a high quality source of information to answer questions about Canadians. So statistical use. So we could eliminate the risk of microdata ever getting out by never releasing anything. Clearly, we're not in the business of never releasing anything. So custodians are responsible for risk management. And we recognize that we want to work with researchers, including with these public use microdata files. Often, you can find these in libraries through the Data Liberation Initiative. We want to be quite clear what these are good for, and we'll get into the uses of various types of microdata a little later. And along with any of these files, you're going to get some information on how you are supposed to use it, what the confidentiality requirements are around it. And in exchange, we're enabling research by interested Canadians and outsiders too. We can share with people from outside of Canada in many circumstances. So now I'm going to get into some disclosure avoidance concepts. So the first thing is the notion of identifiers. And we divide them into two broad groups. So a direct identifier is like, what's your name? Well, and I can locate you by your name with very little extra effort. Your phone number is another good example, various government ID numbers. So what I was talking about, stripping off identifying information, this stuff is gone by the time it gets to an analyst. And that's the kind of the easy part of identifiers. So it's collected in the course of business, either in admin data or in a survey, because we need to, when we take a sample, we need to find the people in the sample and ask them for their information. And then it is immediately siloed off when we're preparing the analytical files. But the more challenging part are identifiers that are also analytically useful. So we can't scrub them off the analytical files because we would not have much analytical file left. So indirect identifiers, date of birth, sex and gender, marital status, educational attainment. So all of these things, if you know somebody, or if you just see them on the street, various people are going to know various things about the people around them, and these ones will often find themselves on the list. So there's no hard line between just an analytical variable and an indirect identifier. It depends on your knowledge of the data provider. And so we have these personal ones, all these things that are tied to a person. We also have household information. Where do you live? Is it in an owned or rented dwelling? The composition of your household. This is a really powerful identifier, especially if you have a household of a few people. If you have even just the age gaps between the members of the household, you can often locate people in a file fairly easily. So these are things that need to be managed carefully, and in combination, these can often reveal things about respondents. And if you can find a household, you can find the people in it. So even if you're mostly looking at individuals, it pays to pay attention to household characteristics as well. And there's also maybe other variables that seem very subject matter specific, but say if you have a big file of health services provided or health adaptive devices, some of them will be obvious. So like the use of oxygen or a mobility device or somebody's sight or hearing abilities or limitations. So what it comes down to is a lot of a data file is going to be indirect identifiers. So these need to be treated fairly carefully. And we'll get down to how to do those in different circumstances. So I'm going to take a sidetrack into routes for re-identification. So these are a couple of ways that you could theoretically match up a person in the data with a person in the world. So one thing you can do, and I talked a bit, I've worked in record linkage for a while, is attempt to perform a record linkage on the microdata. So to do this, I need to have, between my list of people in the world and my data, I want to have some variables in common. And then I need to convince myself that the individual I'm trying to identify is on both files, or all files if you're doing a multi-file linkage. And then this is key, is I want a rare combination of key variables on both sides. So anything I can do to make rare combinations disappear is a good thing. And lastly, I want some verification of population uniqueness. If I have that registry over there, then I can usually work out who's unique if I have those rare combinations going. So what can I do about this? What can I do about a potential record linkage problem? I can sample from one or both files that I'm going to share with a collaborator in a country the size of Canada. A lot of questions can be answered quite well with a sample. StatCan's used sample surveys for years and years, for 100 years now. And we can also reduce the detail in the data. We'll get up into, but effectively rolling up categories to a level that is still useful, but is less risky from the point of re-identification. And if I'm releasing outputs, I want to make sure they're appropriately aggregated. I don't want little lonely cells with one person in them, because that will allow me to maybe find out more things about those people than I want to release in my aggregates. So here's a formal model I talked about. So I have a third party. They have a list of people. And then I have a sample survey or some other sampled source, and it has weights. So I have one kind of census source and one sampled source. They have some overlap in variables. In a real-life situation, at least one of those sources will have been scrubbed of all its direct identifiers. So I'm down to analytical variables and indirect identifiers. And then my third party is going to try to put together somebody in the sample with somebody in the registry, and they are re-identified if I make the link and if it is also correct. So I mean, people can guess and say, I found somebody, but if they didn't actually find somebody, it's not re-identification. So that's a model of record linkage, and we'll come back to some of the countermeasures a little later. Yeah, so we also have another avenue into a data source that we need to manage is the presence of weights. So who here has done a fair amount of sample surveys and complex designs? So I'll take a little segue. So in a survey context, when I'm taking a probability sample, I want to be able to generalize it back up to the population. If I do a simple design, all my proportions will be right. So if I do a simple random sample, all my proportions will be right, and there's some nice constant that I can reinflate everybody back up to the population of interest if I want to calculate totals or other things. But more often than not, a survey will be conducted in a way that's maybe more efficient in the field, or that oversamples populations, both rare populations, populations of interest. So at that point, we're going to have different weights on different individuals to reinflate them back to the original population that we're trying to generalize to. So they're typically inverse probability weights. So whatever my probability of selection was, 1 over that is my weight, at least my starting weight, and then we do non-response adjustment, calibration, a bunch of sequence of modifications to the weights to account for different parts of the survey process. All that to say, these can contain information because somebody in an oversampled population will have a smaller weight than somebody in a larger population. And because we are a federation of 10 provinces and 3 territories, and each of those jurisdictions wants some useful statistics about their population, we often sample a higher fraction of people in a smaller jurisdiction so that they have a useful number, while a larger jurisdiction like Ontario, the sampling fraction is smaller because there's just a lot of Ontario to sample from. So this can give people information about where a sampled unit came from. And the take-home here is that you can't just drop the province and presume that nobody is going to be able to recover the province of a respondent. So you need to be aware that some information is implicit in other variables. And we also, you can sometimes wind up revealing, so geographic information, sometimes household size, sometimes other little bits of information. So if you're already releasing this isn't a problem. But if you needed to remove that to make people harder to re-identify, you also need to treat the weights. So, and we can use methods like weight perturbation. We can cap weights at either end. We should be aware of the information. So as I was saying, if you know that the province is implicit in the weight, you need to act as if everybody knows the province of a respondent. And your documentation, you should document your process. You should be transparent. But in order to make it harder to make the link between a particular individual and whether they appear in the sample or not, to preserve privacy, you don't mention, if you did a cluster design, where your clusters were. A cluster is supposed to be representative of its stratum or of the population as a whole. So you say how you sampled your clusters, but you don't tell people where the clusters were, because that's one step closer to re-identifying somebody. And when you're releasing weights, particularly bootstrap weights, you need to take this into account. And so bootstrap weights are a set of weights released with many microdata files for the purposes of estimating sampling variance. So there are analytic ways of estimating variance and Taylor series, but they don't work for all statistical measures, and they can often be kind of horrible to calculate, and you need to do it once for each statistic that you are going to attempt to estimate. So the solution is to use bootstrap weights, which are a method of implementing a nice, consistent Monte Carlo simulation of a bunch of replicates in order to estimate the variance of a statistic. And just like regular weights, so we were point estimate weights, they can contain extra information about clusters if you're not careful. So the original takes on bootstrap weights, you could look for the zeros in your big matrix of bootstrap weights and you could tell where clusters were. With more modern approaches, the mean bootstrap gets rid of those zeros by combining replicates together. The Poisson bootstrap, which was used, not this census, but the previous one, it doesn't rely on cluster information to generate the weights, so you can't work out where people are being sampled from the weights. So it's just things to be aware of, that your information, your analytical variables and your frame variables can have consequences in other places, like your survey weights. So now we'll come on to risk measures. So we've got a data file and we've got some notion of which variables we want to keep. We want to establish some base notion of how risky this file is. We have some, and also we may want to know if there are particular subpopulations or even just units that could cause us re-identification problems. So one way is to measure multiplicity. So in this case, I choose a set of indirect identifiers, and I'm going to count up the number of n-way combinations of those variables where an individual is unique. The more of those there are, the easier it is to re-identify somebody. The fewer of those there are, the harder it is. And it's usually within a domain, so within a province or a particular population. And so we generally do the computational intensity. We're doing these things 2 or 3 dimensions in the kind of the riskiest areas to get a sense of what we're dealing with in terms of a microdata file. We can also standardize this measure. So, and as I was saying, we can use it to see if it's the same variables generating these unique cases, then we need to take a look at those and see if we can treat them, maybe work at a different level of aggregation. So that's a very simple measure of risk that you can calculate, and it's a unit level measure. So it will point out as a custodian, the individuals in my file that are the riskiest and that I should pay attention to protecting their confidentiality and preventing re-identification. So another similar measure is the risk factor analysis. It feels a little like a geometric mean of probabilities. And so again, in this case, it's how rare are individual values on a record, and then we multiply them together and kind of normalize them, and we get this risk factor, which is a nice bounded value between 0 and 1. So it looks bounded and it looks like that, but it's a relative measure. So you're going to look where these risk factor analysis numbers are closer to 0, and those are the ones that are rare under this kind of independence assumption between your variables. So on multiplicity, we were working directly on bunches of variables, and this one gives you a global for all the variables you care to do the frequencies on. you can get a sense of how risky a unit is looking at that way of classifying them. So then sometimes you want a global measure of risk. And one way of doing this is the Skinner-Elliott measure. So it's a domain level measure, so it's going to tell me how risky, in some cases, just a file or some domain within my file is. And the logic under it is that we're going to simulate somebody trying to match. We're going to treat our file as a sample of some superpopulation, and we're going to simulate somebody trying to match a record they find in the data against the superpopulation. So, and it turns out with the algebra, which I'll spare you for the most part, that you only need to know a couple things about your data. Is you need to count all the unique combinations of indirect identifiers, and you need to count all of the combinations that turn up exactly twice. And then with some massaging of this, and you are able to use the weights, which is something that you can't do with the other measures, is you can use the survey weights to find particularly risky groups in your or particularly to account for the presence of risky individuals that have small weights. So those are populations that are sampled at a higher rate than the rest of them. So if you can imagine, if I have a lot of sample and a lot of uniques and pairs in a highly sampled area, I have a pretty good picture of that highly sampled area. So I may need to rethink how I'm doing my indirect identifiers or possibly my sampling to fix that. So it's a risk measure that the other two let you find particular records that could be problematic. And this one gives you a global measure of what sort of a file you're dealing with that does take the design into account, which is not every method takes the design into account.
So is this something that, given RDC, a statistical analyst would have to do for who does this and how often, how thoroughly?
So this is more custodian kind of work, custodian and data cleaning and staging. You would want to do this as you're figuring out how to place the data in your repository. What code sets to use? Do we need to roll up? Do we need to sample? And then once it's in there, the researcher on the front lines, they have a data with a certain level of detail and certain risk characteristics, and they can be blissfully ignorant of these risk measures.
But I would assume that this has to be done whenever a researcher asks for a particular kind of data set. It has to be analyzed like this before it can be presented in the repo for the researcher. And is that something that is done by the analyst there at the RDC? Right. Or is it done at the StatsCan headquarters?
It would be a headquarters decision, because we decide as an agency a file, it's kind of pre-analyzed, so it's brought in, and then it's analyzed. Risk is assessed, and some treatments of the file may be in order. So as pretty much automatically, you would be looking at stripping off the identifiers. But then further, people use things like disturbance weights, top coding, bottom coding. We'll get into some of the measures that are applied directly on the data. And then the second part that these risk measures will contribute to is some output vetting rules, which will determine what people can do with the data and take it out of the secure confines of the agency and into the world. So, and this can play into both of those sets of decisions.
Yeah, I think that's what he was getting at when I asked for the data to come to me.
Yeah.
Are you doing that comparison before it's sent to me so I can't identify anybody?
Right. So you the researcher, or you the custodian?
I'm a researcher.
Right. So you the researcher. This will have been done once to put it in the repository, and then one of the principles behind this is we're not as worried about a researcher directly going in and saying, "I found Joe," because they're employees. They've been trained in the what to do ethics, what not to do penalties. So, although it is possible that a researcher could go in there and recognize somebody, we're counting on their sense of ethics and the fact that they can't take the data out of the center without a vetting process to manage that risk. Like it's a secure setting and the secure people that we've trained and checked out ahead of time. So what we're really worried about is an output done in good faith, coming out into the world, and some third party reverse engineers the output. So we want to make sure that these outputs that leave the confines of the center are safe and low risk. And we can intervene at a few points in the process, both in making sure that the data, that kind of the obvious trip hazards in the data have been removed, and particularly ones that aren't analytically useful. Like very seldom will somebody need these direct identifiers to do analysis. And in many cases, in some files, you see some variables that are of questionable quality, or that there are some very rare populations that aren't big enough to be analytically useful. And so we're not going to go and take re-identification risks for mediocre or terrible analytical power. We want to. So if there are variables coming in on an in file that we've either been told the coverage is bad, or we look and see there's poor coverage, or it's not analytically useful, or we've got a bunch of sources coming together and the concepts are all different. It may be a good decision to say, listen, this particular variable, we don't have confidence that it's analytically useful, and so why would we take the risk of re-identification through it? So that.
How does that play into socioeconomic analysis then? Because you're giving like postal codes. Like postal codes are used for that.
Right. So there are, on some files, postal codes are stored on the file, and wall to wall, it's a combination of the licensing of Canada Post postal codes and the fact that these are really good identifiers. Like it's a truism that if I have your date of birth and your postal code, there are not very many copies of you with your date of birth and your postal code at any given point in time, or even longitudinally. So they do go into the research data centers in our case, and what they are used for is for deriving contextual information. So distance to a hospital, or we do have some aggregate statistics on income level, proportion of indigenous folks in a postal code, or sometimes we map it to a slightly higher level where we have good numbers. So it's used to fetch contextual data or to calculate a distance, but we would never tabulate anything by postal codes for the twin reasons of it's a bad idea, like confidentiality-wise, and it's not allowed because they're Canada Post postal codes, and they have another layer of strict rules on how you are to use them and not use them. So postal codes are on some files. Often, I can think of in the Canadian Health Measures Survey, it's an optional add-on that you need to justify your need to know the postal code. So if you're doing some sort of environmental analysis where you have fine-grained data on sunlight hitting places, or air quality, or distance to healthcare, or school district, or whatever it is you need to look at, then you justify that ahead of time in your microdata research contract. You say, I need this to go fetch this data, and that becomes part of your project. But then what comes out is a relationship between some health outcome and air quality, or some health outcome and some spatial statistics, some distance to something, or some density statistics. So they're powerful, but they are treated very, very carefully. And likewise, you would never see anything tabulated by date of birth. I think in one case I saw a project where, looking at birth experiences, a researcher went and tabulated things by day of the week of birth. So is it are your experiences and outcomes better or different on a Friday than on a Tuesday than on a Sunday? Which is a very interesting report, which you'd have to Google it and find out what they said in the end. But the actual, like a lot of these really powerful identifiers, they are there so you can calculate an age, so you can calculate a distance to something or some contextual information, but they would never leave the RDC, and they would never leave an analytical shop at headquarters by full-time employees either. Like that's just something we don't do. All right, so I glossed over Skinner-Elliott a bit. I'm going to put a little warning on Skinner-Elliott in that it's kind of a measure that you'd want to do at the outset, but it's also very easy to game. So you can't use it as your sole source of guidance, but it does use weights. And for a first glimpse at your data to see just how much work you're likely to have to do to protect against re-identification, it's a really good place to start. So on to disclosure control. So it's kind of a subset of security, so it's all the stuff involved in, well, in setting various limits on projects and people, data, outputs to protect confidentiality. So how can we do this? I mean, fundamentally, one way we can do it is we can transform the data that we're going to entrust a researcher with by aggregating it, sampling it, doing things to it that make it harder to re-identify people. We can also put restrictions on what people can take out. Like you can have postal codes in there, but you cannot take them out. Or you need a minimum number of people in any given cell in your table. A lot of these are parameterized, so once I picked a measure, once I picked a rule, say a minimum cell size, then if my data is more sensitive or if a certain level is not working out for me, then I can adjust the parameter to ensure that I'm managing risk the way I want to. So I mentioned a few examples of parameterized techniques. There's sensitivity functions, which has a whole vector of parameters based on the top few contributors, mostly used for economic data. Minimum contributing respondents is what it sounds like. I need at least some number of data providers contributing to a statistic for it to be releasable. Or I can add noise to the data, and then I can adjust the magnitude and shape of the noise. So I'll talk about a couple of simple techniques. We have masking and de-identification. So masking is something, it's an obvious solution to a direct identifier. There's a name column in my data. What's the name column doing here? It's gone. Or I fill it with X's or something. I make it disappear. So for a data element that has no particular analytical use, bam, it's gone, it's masked. If I came in with a number provided by my data provider and I want to prevent even the data provider from linking the new file back to their file, so maybe I've added some stuff to a business file that is confidential and protected. One of the things I can do is I can strip off the client number or the person number from the file they have given me and generate my own using some random process or something that does not link back to the original one. So I'm masking, but I still need to be able to find records while I'm holding onto the data, so I generate a new identifier that is completely unrelated to the original identifier and to any of the indirect identifiers. So that's the easy part. Things that don't have analytical value, bam, they're gone, or they're off in my record linkage silo and they will never touch the analytical variables again. The other process, the more subtle process, is de-identification. So that's where I'm going to transform the data in ways that retain analytical usefulness and reduce the risk of re-identification. So some examples of masking: I can suppress entire variables, or I can take out pieces of a table, which is effectively kind of collapsing or doing other things to a table to take out the risky parts. One thing to note is don't do this ad hoc, particularly carving up tables, because if somebody knows the relationships between the cells in a table, they may be able to recover if you just take out a whole row and you leave in a grand total. Well, guess what? I can get the row back by subtracting the sum of cells in a column from the grand total. So we have tools to do this. The current state-of-the-art at StatCan is called gconfid, which applies a linear solver to the question of how many other cells do I need to remove to protect a sensitive cell and prevent it from being recovered to a certain level of precision. Statistics Netherlands, I believe, has tau argus, which does much the same thing. So I'm solving, based on some cells I know I don't want to release, what other cells have to be removed in order to render this table, to break the relationship between my release table and the table with the problematic elements in it. So I can remove things, I can mask things. In the RDCs, I'll probably say this again at some point, we don't do this because cell suppression is a way to create an authoritative table that nobody else is going to try to reproduce in some sense. It does not fare very well when people independently suppress cells in different projects because one set of suppressions may not be compatible with the other and you can undo them. So this is mostly applied on products where you're going to release it once, you're going to give the state of this particular data file, and then it's not going out again. So the other group of techniques, de-identification, we can use grouping on continuous variables. So we take a continuous variable and we create a bunch of dummy variables for different ranges. Or maybe we get a discrete variable in and there's some rare categories or some problematic categories. So we will group them together. A lot of classifications like NAICS and ICD, so the North American Industrial Classification System, or the International Classification of Diseases, they're expressed as strings of digits, and one easy way to roll up is to lop off the least significant digit. And then you have a meaningful category that is a little less detailed and has more people in it. So that's a very straightforward way to aggregate, and it's also consistent. Most researchers, absent a really good reason not to just roll up to a smaller number of digits, will arrive at the same conclusion, at least as the first impulse when you're trying to do that. And it's built-in consistency, which means two researchers are less likely to undo each other's confidentiality work. For magnitude variables, we can also top code them. So effectively have a some high value and more category. We just set those all to those some high value or to the average of that tail of the distribution. So we take an interval, we average it out, and all of the high earners then all have the exact same income, which makes them a lot harder to tell apart. Winds rising is a similar concept. Yeah?
Must have thought about this, but just silly me. If you remove entire segments in your masking, aren't you then possibly biasing your data?
Yes. It is a technique that will protect confidentiality. Some techniques are easier on quality than others. But in this case, you're going to retain the grand total in most cases. So you'll be removing interior cells, and effectively, I mean, it looks like you're carving out a piece of table. You see empty cells with X's for confidentiality. But what you're really doing is you're quietly aggregating all these cells together and saying, the rest of my data is in these cells that I'm not going to give you specific values for. And then you can still calculate population means. And so you won't get detail in the suppressed region, but you'll at least know kind of what all of your suppressed region has contributed to your output. So there are ways to do it badly. I won't say this every time I give you a technique, but there are always ways to do it badly.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking that, let's say, I come from Finland, so if you put it, the native language is Finnish, so
Yeah.
if you remove me from your tables, then you lost all the other information related to me, so if you do it badly, like you said.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, if you're a native language, like maybe you wind up grouping all the Swedish, yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Or you wind up in Finland, let's say you wind up grouping all the Swedish speakers, Danish speakers, English speakers. So you have Finnish and everybody else. And so that's a collapsing approach. Or maybe there's certain regions where minority languages are have these small populations that are going to be disclosive, that are going to enable re-identification. Maybe it's just in these regions that I'm going to lump all the other languages together, but I need to be very careful that I can't recalculate using the grand total in the other categories, so I'm going to have to suppress other places than just my problematic cells usually. So that's, and if there are two people studying language in Finland, they can trip over each other's techniques very easily, which is why we generally encourage rolling up or modeling or other techniques that don't involve suppressing cells. So, and I think it's safe to say among the techniques, suppression is still very widely used, but it's used very carefully. So we have Winsorizing, which is rather than changing the data, I'm going to specify that when people are calculating moments of the data, that they leave out the extreme values, that they say that a researcher explicitly says, I am calculating on the middle 90% of my data or the middle 99% of my data, and the ends are left out. So I think back when I was in university, they referred to this as the biased judges in Olympic figure skating. They drop the judges at the either ends of the range. And so it's a similar technique, but applied to continuous variables on a population where we want to protect the outliers. We can also do things to the data that are a little less arithmetic. We can swap data around within domains, which then we wind up with records that have combinations of keys that don't actually exist in the population. But your marginals will be the same, and if you do this carefully within domains, this can be a way to create a de-identified file that's both pretty analytically useful and very, very hard to match back to an outside source. So, and if you're, this is good for marginals, this is good for summary statistics. If you're wanting to develop regression models or something, you probably want to kick the tires with data that's been swapped and then become a trusted researcher and go in and work with data that hasn't been swapped. So, and one of the good ethical custodian practices is to, you don't need to give the parameters and the details of what you've done to a microdata file that you are sharing with researchers, but you should give them a notion of what you've done to it so that they don't go thinking that this is fit for a particular purpose when in fact it's much better for some other purpose. And we can also, I mean, we use modeling and hot deck imputation and stuff when we have missing data that when collected in the wild organically is missing. We can also punch out variables here and there and model them. And again, that will break the link a bit between the microdata file for analysis and the re-identifiable people in the wild, thus preventing re-identification. So these are techniques that you can apply to microdata, particularly when you're going to place them in a less secure setting. If you do a bunch of these things, it will be very, very hard to re-identify, and you wind up with a public use microdata file, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I'm going to move on to, I'm going to talk a bit about some disclosure scenarios, some avenues for re-identification that we try and keep in mind and work against, and craft our rules and techniques with regards to these. So first of all is identity disclosure. Can I re-identify somebody on the file? That's kind of the primordial scenario. I find Amanda on the file. So what can I, this?
It's not true.
No, I have not. And I haven't looked because I'm an ethical researcher. So that's where I find Amanda in the file. And if there's some analytical variables on that file as well, then I can have attribute disclosure, which is the next slide. So there you see the value of keeping your identifiers and your analytical variables separate is that puts a speed bump in front of that. Also, I can sample the file, and then maybe Amanda's on the file, or maybe she isn't. So if I find somebody that looks like what I can observe of Amanda, I'm going to stop picking you in a second. I'm not sure if it is Amanda, and that introduces some uncertainty. I can aggregate so that at a lower resolution version of my person I'm looking for, they look like a bunch of other people. So by saying I'm going to do age ranges rather than birth dates, or I'm going to group non-Finnish languages together and have a Finnish language category. And of course, there's removal of identifiers. So then the next step, the next scenario is attribute disclosure, which is where not only have I found somebody on the file, but now I can get some information about them. So the primary method of avoiding attribute disclosure is to avoid identity disclosure. So other things you can do, so protect against identity disclosure, and this comes back to don't do garbage research. Don't let overfit models out. They don't generalize well, they're not really good research, and they're also a confidentiality risk. So sometimes quality and risk, you're balancing them, but in the case of an overfit model, you're effectively trashing them both, so don't do it. And with full cells, sometimes you do need to know that a characteristic is concentrated in part of your population, but you need to be careful, particularly in multi-dimensional tables. Full cells can be an attribute disclosure risk, so they are something to look at closely when you're releasing outputs. So another scenario is inferential disclosure. So now we're not relying on re-identifying someone as much as taking a class of people and being able to identify, to estimate characteristics of them very closely. And this again, if the class is very big and if the estimate has some noise in it, if there's some uncertainty, we're doing well. So it's when you get into these very small classes, or when you get very precise estimates, or you find out that everybody with characteristic A, so like all the tilapia users are also smokers. This is a problem. We need to maybe think about people's fish consumption in a broader way so that we're not outing all the closet smokers. So that's something, again, and we have concepts, and I won't dig into differential privacy, but differential privacy is a notion that I can create a file where the presence or absence of any one record is not going to change my estimate. And I work next to the people that really understand this, but it's a growing and yeah, it's not nascent, it's been around for a few years, but it's definitely a rising technique, and the US Census Bureau is working quite a bit with it. Yeah. And another thing we can do is we can work on, particularly with magnitude data, using dominance rules where if I have in a population somebody has all the stuff, usually the money, or perhaps time or family size or any of these magnitude variables, if somebody has a vast majority of the stuff, or if a few major players have a vast majority of the stuff in a cell, so production, staff, whatever, then if you've got two competitors at the top of the cell, they can each identify, they can each estimate each other's values very closely. If I have one dominant player and a bunch in the tail, then everybody can estimate the dominant player's value. So we want to make sure that our cell, and again, it keeps coming back to that cell is too specific. That cell is getting very close to re-identifying somebody or releasing their information. So being aware of your parameters for the sizes of cells and the aggregation of your variables and your independent variables can be very important. So last in my tour of disclosure routes is residual disclosure. And this is where we have a bunch, and this I've alluded to this with cell suppression, but it's not just a cell suppression issue, is where a bunch of good faith researchers, or in fact somebody releasing version 1 of their thesis and then gets some feedback and releases version 2, they tweak the population a bit. And sometimes what happens is you can difference these nice innocuous publications or releases, and you can find out about the the difference between them. So for instance, if version 1 of my thesis included indigenous people, and version 2, my thesis supervisor said that you should only really include First Nations and we'll leave the Inuit and Métis out of your thesis because you're blurring your conclusions or something. Well, now, if I look at version 1 and version 2, I can find out things about Inuit and Métis people that that might be about too small a population or too much detail. So one of the things we do here is we try and get the person's thesis supervisor on the research contract so that they can come in and look at the outputs in a secure setting and iterate in the secure setting and just bring out the final results. And this is maybe the most powerful technique against residual disclosure, is to release things into the world when they're ready, and do not release things into the world when you're still kind of tweaking them around and figuring out what you're doing. So bring your collaborators into the secure setting, get them all vetted and trained, and then you can work with the real data in the setting and bring out just the results that need to see the light of day. Standard classifications are great for this too. So a classic example is if I have 5-year age bands, and I say everybody that's doing age bands, you're going to use 5 or some multiple of 5, then it's much better than if one person uses 4-year age bands and another uses 5. And then I have, in various places, these little 1-year age bands, which might be more disclosive than I want. Yeah, and we'll get into post hoc. If somebody does have multiple versions of their thesis going out, another method you can use against this is to require some rounding, to introduce a bit of noise so that the magnitude of the rounding is greater than the magnitude of the potential problematic cells. So just to come back to a high level again, there's a notion that came out of the UK ONS, the Office of National Statistics, at the beginning of the century. Felix Ritchie and his team, of having five kind of variables you can tweak in terms of protecting the confidentiality of your microdata. So he had safe projects, safe people, safe data, safe output, and safe settings. So, and I think we've touched on these directly and indirectly in the first half of this presentation. There's some, Elliot and company have some more discussion of safe versus safer. But we can look at a couple of different sources in terms of this. So one way to do this with a public use microdata file, this is a file that you can find in a university library. Anybody can walk in. There used to be a license, and now the license is implicit. You don't even have to sign for it. You can get this file, look at it, do some preliminary analysis, do what you want with it, basically. But the one thing they do is that they perturb the data heavily. They are very selective about which variables go in. They aggregate. Like pretty much every technique, not everyone, but a large number of techniques discussed up till now are all applied to public use microdata file. It is swapped. It is top-coded. It is sampled. So you get this file that is really good for generating hypotheses, for getting a sense of what's in there, for student work. If you're more interested in teaching people statistics than you are talking about the particular situation of child welfare in Hull, this is a file that you can easily access and that has been quite perturbed and is good for getting started and for this hypothesis generation step. And we put all our eggs in the safe data basket. We say this is data that is going to be extremely difficult to re-identify. We have broken most of the links between our data entities and our real live people out in our data providers. So that's one extreme. And then in the research data centers, we have kind of the opposite extreme. In order to have data that is much richer, so we anonymize the data. We do what we would do in-house. In exchange, we ask people to apply to do a particular project in there and describe it and demonstrate that it's feasible. And then the data holding division at StatCan gets a chance to examine that and say that this is a legitimate project that has a that is both not risky and that has a decent chance of producing quality outputs. Because not risky is great, but we also want an aspect of quality, and that's the approved projects is our chance to promote quality in what's done with the data. Trusted people, and by trusted we mean trained, oathed, background check. And then the outputs are generated by the researchers. They get to do their research, and they have some freedom to explore that with full knowledge of the disclosure rules, and they will produce an output that they are pretty sure passes the rules, and then they'll get a second pair of eyes from the RDC analyst who will make sure that the rules have been applied right and that those outputs are good to go. And if there's some disagreement, we have a chain of appeals and committees and people to keep looking at it until it's quite resolved. And it's an extremely secure setting. Like, there are restrictions on mobile devices, printing. It's a thick steel door in many cases. They've thought of, this is up to Treasury Board, this physical safety, IT safety standards, and so it's embedded in a university, but it is effectively a little chunk of StatCan with all of the security standards that would apply at head office in this room or little suite of rooms, often in a university library or across the street in this case. So yeah, so that's 5 safes, and you can put all your eggs in one basket, or you can have this kind of blended approach. And the more you use other techniques, the richer the data you can put in place. So next up, a bit on microdata confidentiality. How are we doing for time? Shall we call it a coffee break? Yeah, just looking at the fact that there is coffee and and that it's 2:25. So I guess nobody's going very far, but we'll pick up in about 15, 20 minutes. who we are, released every year, just kind of a fun statistical primer on Canadian humans and their economy and habits. And yeah, I haven't looked what all is in there this year, but yeah, so that being said, thank you for sticking around, and we'll move on to a section on microdata confidentiality. And so, I keep talking about the things that can go wrong, ways of re-identifying people. So there must be a reason we're doing this. So why would we want to work from microdata? Well, I mean, it lets us give the users some freedom as to what sort of analysis they want to do, because the more you aggregate and the more you can give people all the shelf tables they want, but then it's hard to do certain sorts of analysis from pre-aggregated data. So it lets users slice and dice the data into the domains that they need for their particular research questions. So if the domains on a education analysis or looking at school districts are going to be different from health regions or the LGBTQ2 population, which you can detect in some data sets, or non-English speakers or official language. So you have all these domains, and if we process and say, here's your outputs, then perhaps the domain that a researcher needs to know about is not in the official release. And there's always more groups of people or different ways of seeing Canadians that we want to encourage people to look at and do research about. Also, certain sorts of modeling work a lot better with microdata. You could take a shelf table and say, well, there's 4,000 observations there. I'm just going to copy this 4,000 times and throw it into my modeling package, or I'm going to weight it up, but I'm losing the detail that was discarded to create the tabulation, even a fairly detailed one. So for advanced statistical techniques, often microdata has to go into the technique. So we don't want to have a monopoly on that as a custodian. We want to invite people into places like the RDCs to do this sort of work, because we don't have a monopoly on clever, and we don't have enough people even to do all of the work that could be done with the data that we've collected for Canadians. Also, by giving people that aren't us access to the data, we are getting more eyeballs on the problem and increasing user trust. People are doing related work, coming to their own conclusions, using their own hypotheses and critical faculties and stuff to arrive at conclusions from the data that StatCan collects or that another custodian has available. And there's replicability, there's science, there's saying, yes, this analysis seems to make sense because different people are doing it with their own particular skills and perspectives, and we're getting good results repeatedly. So we're increasing the user trust, and people could go in and replicate even results generated in an official product. And generally, because the files are very similar in the RDCs and up on the 24th floor in health analysis, they're going to be able to do the same things and check us and make increase the credibility of the results generated inside the agency, inside your data holding organization. You can do those outside or in these controlled settings by different people who will do the replication part of science on the same data. So also, I've talked a bit, and my other area of specialty since I joined the agency is record linkage, and you basically can't do record linkage without microdata. And as I was talking, you have these two silos, and so we do have the identified microdata with no analytical variables, and people are putting this together, storing the relationships, taking the identifiers out, and then associating things like we have in the Justice Statistics Center, we've had a recontact project looking at people's repeated contact with the justice system across policing, courts, and corrections. So often these systems have some walls and difference in collection between them. A record linkage can bring these together and see how people actually progress through the policing, courts, and corrections systems. Clearly looking at outcomes, if we have a health survey, say the National Population Health Survey, where we had a bunch of repeated measures, but we want to find out how these people are doing now. we can link to hospital usage, mortality, other files to follow up and without actually tracking these people down, see how they're doing. And that's something you can only do when you have microdata on your hands. Yeah, another advantage of microdata is that people are in there looking at it, working with it, and our users can tell us what they need to see or how they're finding it, using it. They can also perhaps even spot problems if there's problems in a file. So again, it's the more eyeballs. One thing to note about record linkage at Statistics Canada is now and for a long time, perhaps I can't think of a time when it wasn't true, the National Statistical Agency, we do the record linkage and then we create these linked, de-identified, anonymized files and place them in a research data center or give them to our analytical staff rather than having other people, rather than having non-StatCan employees do the record linkage, because it's deemed a little too risky to put all those personal identifiers in the hands of people that aren't strictly us. And also we want a consistent linked file between different projects for replicability purposes. So I'm going to start with a very simple model of microdata research. So we have our data providers. We collect some microdata from them. We put it in a big bin of microdata. We de-identify it. We treat it. We get it ready for use. And then our analyst at the agency does some research inside the fence. And they check it with their supervisor. They institutionally review it. They peer review it. And then at some point, out it goes into the world. Now this hashed area is our secure perimeter where data that is sensitive and maybe re-identifiable can live. Outside the hashed area is the rest of the world. And aside from me knowing what my responses are for a survey, other people are not supposed to be able to re-identify people. So the researcher does their work, applies the guidelines, checks it out with their chain of command, consults as necessary, and when it's ready to go out, it goes out. So that's kind of the analyst on the 24th floor model. They are inside and they do their work inside. But we'll come to some different sorts of model of how data gets out in a little bit. So we have a few different sorts of microdata files, and I think I've alluded to two of them already. So these are the ones that we currently have numbers of them around the agency and with our collaborators. One is the research data center file. Another one is the public use microdata file. And the third category that I haven't talked about very much is the share file. And so, and I'm also going to discuss a little bit an alternative to sharing microdata with researchers that gives you some of the power of microdata, but has some distinct advantages in other areas. So the first type, and I've talked about it a bit, is the research data center file. It's basically the richest file we will trust people with once it's processed. It's offered to researchers who are not StatCan employees, but who we're going to deem as employees. So we remove the direct identifiers, but most of the data is pretty much as collected and cleaned up. And researchers who want to work with the research data center file come to us, but we have created these little instances of us across universities and in some federal government departments called research data centers. There's a university flavor and a federal government flavor, but they're basically the same concept. So you come to this and you are supervised by a StatCan employee who's there to help and guide you in the process and ensure that whatever you're going to bring out of the RDC, and in fact it's not going to be the researcher that brings it out, you're going to basically hand your outputs to the analyst and they will ensure that all the rules are followed and that is a legitimate releasable output, and then they will hand or email it to you outside the RDC. So you've got this access control by a StatCan employee who is trained in confidentiality and in running a research data center as well. And StatCan brings the physical and data security to the RDC up to our standards. It's all the federal government standards for StatCan apply in this little, effectively, box in a university of StatCan or in a federal government department. So that's and we did the comparison earlier, the other end of the spectrum here is the public use microdata file. So these are treated to make re-identification very hard. So I talked a bit, and there's another way of doing this. But we're trying to break the link between the record and the person in the world. But we still want a useful file for doing things like marginal distributions, data file structure. One thing we do is sometimes, and we'll get to this, you want to test a program on reasonable facsimile of the real data before you drive into a university research data center or make a custom request or something, and make sure that your code performs as expected before you go to the trouble of bringing the code to some real data. So that's another use of this, is to test out programs. Yeah, and it's good for getting the lay of the land, for formulating questions, coming up with some hypotheses that you want to test on less perturbed data. And it's offered through the Data Liberation Initiative, whose licensing has recently gotten even more relaxed, more generous. You can go to a library, and I think even to the StatCan website, and with minimal, read the license, read the fine print. But it's basically, you can have these things on demand. And then the third type are share files. And who do we share these with? Basically, often it's the provincial authorities about whose users or citizens or whoever the data is collected. So if we do a national health survey, then we may, and often do, provide a de-identified copy of just the respondents from a given jurisdiction to the health authorities in that jurisdiction, so they can do their own monitoring of how their system is working, do some research, but just on the people that they're responsible for. And oftentimes, so we scope it down, and this is something that we do with respondents' permission. So in a lot of our, particularly health surveys, or where I've been working, there is often a question near the end, after you've got a sense of the data that you've provided to the survey taker. One of the last questions is, do you agree for your anonymized responses to be shared with provincial authorities, with your provincial authorities? So if I'm in Quebec, Ontario government doesn't get my data. And if I'm in Quebec and I say no, Quebec government doesn't get my data. And then when we deliver a share file to a provincial authority, then the envelope of confidentiality gets a little bigger, because then they are wrapped up under all of the confidentiality responsibilities that we have with regards to that data. So, So and here's the alternative to giving microdata to the people that you want to share data with and that you want to do detailed analysis with, is a technique called real-time remote access. So I think there's 40-ish statistical programs now, and I'm sitting beside the guy that is working on getting more into real-time remote access. And what it is for every file that's in there, we create a dummy file or a pump file for people to test their programs on and get a sense of the record layout and the size of the file and some of the details of processing it. And they develop a program, and then when they're satisfied with it, they send it to, so there's real-time, and there's also an older version. They either send it through an automated system that will check the program, reduce any syntax that is not allowed, run it against the actual data, keep an audit trail, and then within a few minutes, send it back to the researcher. And you need to agree to a license, get an account, and your token has a limited number of hits per day on the real-time remote access, so that it's hard to gorge yourself on data and maybe cause re-identification risks within a short period of time. So it's for trusted people who don't want to physically come to the office and go through the whole RDC process. It's a way for them to write programs that meet their analytical need, submit them from a distance, and get vetted outputs back. And then the old school version is effectively the same, except it's a real human that receives your program, runs it, examines the outputs, checks it against the rules, and sends it back to you. So that's, I have a schematic here. So, and this is kind of the real-time version. The researcher spends some time with a dummy file, writes up their analytical program, sends it in, either a human or a server, runs it on the real data, runs securely, implies some output checking and in this case also, it's not heavily perturbed, but the level of detail on a lot of variables is reduced and the number of variables are reduced. This is really for getting a quick sense within a domain or doing a bit of analysis. It's not the level of detail you'd expect as an analyst or in the RDC. And then the output is sent back to the user. Yeah. So that's real-time remote access or the older remote access without the real-time part. Yeah, so that's kind of a spectrum of ways to do analysis on microdata from using these various flavors of files, some of which are dependent on who you are and where you are. And then the real-time remote access, which is for known people to go and do this analysis at a distance. So we're going to kind of dip back into microdata confidentiality strategies. And we're going to lump them into a few different groups. So yeah, first we can reduce the data. So I mean, we talked about removing, I'm sounding like a bit of a broken record, but remove the direct identifiers, which is a good minimum. Hash or replace or otherwise deal with any record ID that could be linked to outside files. We can also reduce detail. I talked about grouping continuous variables into classes and then adjusting your classes until you have the right level of detail for the research and for the re-identification risk you're willing to accept. You can also take out variables or take out values for certain units, either outliers or randomly, to introduce a bit of noise by missing data. And in some cases, we will then impute the data so that people don't know which variables have been suppressed. And of course, we announce to the user that we have done this to it. And last, we can do a subsampling where we just sample from either the admin file or the sample file to reduce the chances that any given individual in the population is also in the file. So we can also, perturbation is a large class of techniques. One thing we often want to do is treat extreme values. So, often dollar values, but also if somebody is in and out of the hospital many, many times or staying a long period of time, you may want to take these exceptionally heavy users in one way or another of the health system and make them a little harder to single out. So yeah, we can take, so the treating extreme values, that includes things like microaggregation and Winsorization and things where we can, particularly where we're working categorically. It can overstate precision because if you take, say, the top 5% of the values and you map them all to one value, well, your variance is going to go down. And so at that point, you may find yourself making spurious conclusions. So you label the fact that you're doing this. You let researchers know what you've done to the data. And subgroup analysis. So you can, when you're doing this treating extreme values, often you're working within domains. Or if you work globally and then somebody goes to a domain, this is a little hand-wavy, but let's say that I have one exceptionally heavy health user in one place, and then the next 4 people in my ranking of health users are in different places, then when I average all of them out and assign the mean or median to all of those users, I'm going to create more health use in different regions, or I'm going to create the appearance of health use in places where it wasn't. So I am making it harder to spot that heavy health system user, but I may be perturbing the data in a way that creates the impression of use in places where it wasn't. So that's something to watch out for, is when you're doing perturbation in a certain domain and then somebody else is doing analysis in a different domain, you can have what we sometimes call stratum jumpers, people moving, or masses of stuff, money, time, moving in ways that you didn't anticipate and that can do funny things to your analysis. So it works well for categorical data analysis. It works well when you know your usual domains ahead of time, but it's all of these techniques, you need to be kind of aware of what you're doing and do your analysis accordingly. So top coding is basically a special case of treating extreme values. It's everything. So I was talking at the break, for large families, we generally have a number of children, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 or more. Because in a given smallest geographic area, there's probably, if there is a family with 7 kids, everyone's going to know who they are. So in order to protect these unusual family household sizes, we just say big household, not giving you more detail. And that's, even at the microdata level, often it's coded like that to protect those individuals. So that can be done for dollar amounts as well. You know, obviously the top 1%, we might just cut off at the 99th percentile of income and say, anybody with a value at the 99th percentile, it could be anywhere in the distribution beyond that. And we're not telling you so that you can't spot, you know, which religion this very rich person is if I happen to have a religion by income file or something like that. So that's, again, we're kind of taking the outliers and we're making it harder to tell between them. Yeah, and again, you have it's going to reduce the spread of your data. But for categorical analysis, if I'm just looking at the characteristics of the top 1% versus the characteristics of some other income group, then it's good enough for that. And again, averaging extreme values, it's going to be a little gentler with the spread. Again, it's going to do some things to the variance. And again, it's stable and known domains are your friend. These multi-purpose files, which is a lot of what a statistical agency will work in, is collect a file and then use it for many, many things. So a health survey could be used for anything from looking at the self-perceived health effect of socioeconomic status to how vegetable consumption and exercise vary with each other. And so we don't know what the domains or what the variables of interest are when we're collecting this kind of omnibus health survey. So they make more sense in economic statistics, where often there's a few very important variables at play, and it's more the domains that you're worried about. So another thing you can do to prevent exact re-identification is rounding variables. So effectively reducing precision on these quantitative variables. We can also round to different degrees in different bands, and this is something that one of the places that it's applied is in real-time remote access, where we have a complicated and confidential rounding table that will inject kind of an appropriate amount of noise into different magnitudes of estimates. And the standard rounding, where you go to the nearest multiple of the base, is one option, and it's probably not the best. Often we'll do unbiased random rounding. So both statistically, regular rounding, if your data is not uniform, your rounding may introduce bias, particularly if you've got a lot of people in a region between two rounding bases. But the unbiased random rounding, it both removes the bias and it makes it harder to undo, because the range of original values from which a treated value could have come is considerably larger, usually about twice as big. So if rounding's not your cup of tea, or if you want to protect even the ones that are already hit the rounding base, you can add noise. So you would generate a noise vector and add it to your data in a certain variable. Yeah, there's also multiplicative noise, and as long as you pick a distribution for your noise that has an expectation of 0, you keep your means. It can do some funny things to your other statistics, and sometimes certain values are special. I mean, often a 0 value is quite different from any positive value. Like, it's the absence of something. So and adding noise to a variable, well, additive noise anyway, you may not preserve zeros. You may get nonsensical values, like if there's an employment insurance benefit sits in a range from 0 to some theoretical maximum. If I add noise to people's EI benefits, I'm going to get values that sit beyond the maximum. And I will explain that I'm adding noise, but people are still going to find that some of their results might not make sense. So you have to be aware of that and either kind of fix that in your perturbation or, yes?
So what kind of checks do you have in place, since you are now messing up with the original data and person X doing there, and
Yeah.
now someone else later is working on that data,
Yeah.
pulling it from repo?
Yeah.
How do they realize that my data is not garbage, but at least could be biased or wrong? So what's the feedback mechanism?
Yeah. So, well, the first check is that you do this is a custodian level of intervention, so you're going to do it once.
But it was done, let's say, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Custodian did it. Now someone does research on that.
Yeah.
How does this person know that results are wrong?
Yeah.
Or potentially wrong? And how does the custodian know that I shouldn't have done that? Perhaps I should change my method in future.
Yeah.
What's
So,
the feedback?
so there is feedback because you've got in some cases a real human in the RDC talking with the researchers, helping them figure out how to produce their results. I'm still trying to come at your question, but there's at StatCan, there's consultation with the users. There's often advisory panels that help build the surveys, including the confidentiality strategy. It should be part of the survey design, working out what the confidentiality strategy is going to be for your survey. Amanda?
It's not my area, but just based on what you're saying, so if noise is introduced, right, the custodian introduced the noise, I'm guessing there's some documentation.
Oh, yes,
that
yeah.
would state, there's been some perturbation, in this case, noise, so in the case of EI, if you see like a figure of whatever, 200, let's say the maximum is 150,
Yeah.
if you see a 200, you know that obviously it's up, that 200 really is going to be up to 150. I'm guessing there must be some sort of documentation.
Oh,
that would
for sure.
guide, so that when the custodian is sharing with other users,
Yeah.
they would be aware of the fine print. There's always got to be fine print, right, the
So
metadata.
it's really up to the researcher really to read
Yeah.
all the fine print.
That's what
Yes.
I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And try to,
Yeah.
Read the fine microdata. Read the fine metadata. So we heard it from the Portage Network earlier about one of their strong points is making sure that you have detailed and standard microdata going out with the data in these repositories, and similarly in the RDCs, there is a fair amount of documentation that comes with a data file, and it is there on the drive with the data, and then the output vetting rules are also there in the RDC for the researchers to look at and follow. So if you're working with these data with this data with a custodian like StatCan, there will be ample information on what we've done to it. Maybe not the exact parameters, but often I know in RTRA there's a guarantee for a given file that the noise is not going to move the value by more than K%. And then you just have to be aware that there's that little bit of extra variance, and you should adjust your techniques accordingly and adjust
I'm
your.
just thinking how as a researcher I need to be really careful because of this, and perhaps even robust test my results with introducing my own noise on
Yeah.
top of the unknown noise that you added there, just to see how robust my results are. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is a price to pay for getting access to rich data that's been treated, which is sometimes it's more work, and we'll get into a bit of the extra work that RDC researchers joyously do so they can get at their microdata, but that is also there to make sure that the releases are as safe as possible. So yeah, and noise, some distributions are not affected as much by noise as others. Yeah, it'll make your tests more conservative, which, I mean, it's always nice to have a more conservative test. If you find something, you know that that you in fact did find something. So a lot of the swapping and noise will tend to reduce the p-value or make the p-value worse than. And so if you do find significance with the noise in there, it's also probably significant without the noise in there. at a reasonable sample size, which we're all using reasonable sample sizes, right? So that brings us to, so noise is really adding something to a continuous variable. But I do want to be able to protect categorical variables as well, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. One technique that we use is swapping. So we're going to take a block of variables that often are correlated together from one record and swap them with the same block on another. I mean, we do try and make sure that they're correlated to these little parcels of variables, partly to make the data still make sense at the other end and have the nice, some of the correlations between those little blocks be there, and also to make it harder to undo the swapping. Because if two variables are clearly swapped, then it's as if we didn't do any swapping at all. So we want to make it realistic, both for the purposes of preserving some of those correlations between the members of the parcel of variables we're swapping, and also to protect the data further. So yeah, so clearly, I mean, if we swapped sex and we didn't swap number of pregnancies in a lifetime, somebody might undo a fair amount of our swapping. And it can be done randomly, or you can have some systematic approaches to swapping, mostly hitting outliers or doing different rates in different strata. So often you do it within a category. And one of the things that is often publicized when you treat a data with swapping is some sort of swap rate. So it'll give the users an indication of just how much perturbation was added, without telling them that I swapped record 83 with record 209. So it's hard. They can't undo it, but they do know how much noise was introduced by swapping. So it's going to preserve univariate distributions. Unlike noise, it's not going to introduce out-of-range values. So if I swap quantitative values, I'll still have realistic values everywhere. And if I do it in these parcels, I can keep some of the correlations that are important to me. And again, with the understanding, with the proviso that sometimes people find innovative uses for data, and variables that have been swapped independently, they may try and do research on that, and that's where they need to know that this has happened, and maybe come in to do the research on less perturbed data once they've kicked the tires of the analysis.
So if I understood correctly, now you will have pregnant males then in your example, right?
Yeah, and somebody may be able to undo that swap if, yeah.
Pregnancies, so that's when you swap those.
Yeah. So, yeah, and we can get in, I organized the presentation on sex and gender, and so, the undoing it's never as certain as you might think at first blush, but yeah, in this case, what may help is to keep the details of any systematic swapping. You keep that light, so even if they know that that's probably not the correct number of pregnancies for that male fellow, they don't know quite where to put that number in the data set, because you've either got a large pool or because you don't give too much detail on how you shuffled the variables around. So yeah, and again, it's the same thing when you're looking for correlations. This is going to tend to mute your ability to find significant, it's going to reduce your statistical power when you're trying to model relationships. So keep that in mind, and unless you're extremely lucky/unlucky, a significant finding on perturbed data is likely to, if you do get your hands on the unperturbed data, is likely to agree with that. Although a finding of no significance might just be the perturbation tamping down your power. So another perturbation method is microaggregation. So if it's fairly similar to the averaging at the ends, except now we're going to order everybody and aggregate them in little bands and bins. So if you can imagine, like, one option is obviously we talked about taking a continuous variable and binning it. But if you have some weird distribution, sometimes the center of the bin is not really where the center of the mass of the people in the bin is. So this kind of tries to fix that problem. And we can cluster, we can order it, but then we can stratify our little ordered lists and do that so that we get a pretty realistic distribution. But then nobody's original value is there, so if there's a chance of somebody looking up an original value, there are no original values left, and unlike some of the unlike noise, because it's a convex sort of an operation, I'm not going to kick values out of range by microaggregating if I stratify it in a sensible way. So, but it will knock down your overall variance, which means you have to be darn sure that's significant, because you will be falsely inflating the power if you're not careful. So, not by a lot though, depending on how micro your microaggregation is, but it's something you still should pay attention to. So, another perturbation technique is post-randomization. So if you've worked with Markov chains at any point, it's kind of like that. We're going to take a known transition matrix. So then I can publish this transition matrix, and then I'll just apply it to my data using a stochastic model, and I'll spit out new kind of similar values using the transition matrix. And because I've told you the entire story of how this matrix works, then we can have an exact assessment of the impact on variance, and I can also get a pretty good notion of what the distribution was without being able to recover individuals' values if there's enough noise introduced by the matrix. So one principle we can use to see if we're doing enough on microdata perturbation techniques or treatment is k-anonymity. So we apply some methods, and then we're pretty sure we've done a good job if for some value k that we choose as a function of how much we want to reduce the risk, I can find, for every record I can find k minus 1 twins. So now I have groups of at least k records that are indistinguishable. So often you have to aggregate pretty hard to do this, but in a simple data set, this may be, this is a pretty strong guarantee of that you prevented effective re-identification. So broadly, all the perturbation methods, you have treated data that, to one degree or another, looks like the real thing. So it's good for testing, good for hypothesis testing, or good for hypothesis generation. When you're releasing perturbed data, you, as I mentioned, you want to be clear with your users as to the methods you've used, and at least the broad generalities, what they can expect you to have done with the values. Not so much that they can reverse it. So often you want to hold on to some parameters and keep them secret, but enough so that they know what they're getting into and what they can use the data for. So next up we have so we've talked a bit about microdata, so transforming before the analysis takes place. We can also protect on the other end. So data products, there's kind of a broad range of these, from treated microdata to kind of counts and frequencies in tables or on their own, means, ratios, and then some more statistical measures, from something like a range to model parameters. And I promised another way of dealing with breaking the respondent to data element link, and that's synthetic data, which we'll talk a little bit about. So we basically, if we're going to produce these summary statistics tabulations, one option we've already looked at is to treat the underlying data. If I can make the underlying data safe enough for my purposes, then anything I do with that will not get more risky. So the worst I can do is recover the original data that I've deemed to be safe enough. The other approach, and this is more of an RDC approach, is to give people really rich data and say your outputs have to meet these requirements, and that's kind of where the rest of this presentation is going. So that means, given things that we know about the project and the user, we can use slightly different levels of protection, and we do have that real data underlying. So any statistic is going to be exact as much as your input data is exact. So, if it's a census, it may in fact be down to the non-survey error in the census, and on a survey, hopefully you're dominating all the other sources of error with your sampling error. So yeah, And then the other option is to generate synthetic microdata. So what happens is we go in and we take regular data records, which the people working on that at StatsCan call them organic data. And so those have a nice link to the individual data providers. And then we're going to create synthetic data designed to retain the statistical properties of the original, but by using, currently they're using a technique called classification and regression trees. So they kind of create a tree of little models, one variable at a time, working their way through the data, and create an analytically equivalent file that contains 0% real respondents. So, and one use of this was they were creating a health outcome file for a datathon at a conference in Banff. So this was going to be outside the fence. We don't have a research data center in Banff. We had a bunch of conference attendees who were willing to promise to be good, but who we were going to give synthetic data to reduce the risk, and because this was as much a learning exercise as a drawing conclusions about the health outcomes of Canadians. And they were able to prepare that data in a reasonable amount of time with a fairly straightforward, just classify model all the way down through the data file. In addition, this was an experiment, so they also pre-treated the data a bit so that worst case it could only go back up to a Pumphy sort of a level. But as a proof of concept, they were able to go from a Pumphy file to one that they couldn't recover the Pumphy file from in a fairly straightforward manner. So now I'm going to move on to talking a bit about the research data centers, which kind of showcase a bunch of our output controls. So there's one across the way there. And here's how this works, is we have the agency in the stripes here that holds some microdata. We treat it a little bit. We stick it in a box, either co-located with the rest of the agency as in the federal or in a university campus. A researcher does their research in consultation with an analyst. They help them get it straightened out and work properly with the data and follow the disclosure rules. And then once the researcher is ready to release it, they hand it to the analyst with a bunch of supporting documentation and make the case that they have created a safe enough output. And if the analyst agrees, then they will pass it to them on the other side of the fence. So in the simpler model, the research and the verification of risk were done by the same person or by people kind of in the same organization. And here now we have somebody from kind of the outside who's going to come in, and so they're going to have a person with a specific role to guide them and help them create outputs that respect confidentiality. So what is it? It's this physically and IT-related secure facility where researchers can get access to analyst-grade microdata. And like I alluded to before, there's basically an air gap between the machines in the RDC and the outside world. The software is managed by the RDC. The decisions are made by the analyst and by the RDC program as to what's installed on those computers. And a researcher will get the data that they have made the proposal for and justified for their project placed into their account in the RDC, and then that's their sandbox to work in to do their work. And so the analysts are StatCan employees, so they're both there at orientation, training, and, well, I sit on the vetting committee, so I think the most important thing they do is they screen outputs on the way out, but they're running the place, and one of the last steps in any project is to vet out the output and verify that it's good to go into the world. So what's in there? We have de-identified microdata similar to what analysts use. It's still considered sensitive statistical information, which is a legal term, which means that it doesn't touch email, it doesn't go off the premises, it's handled only by employees. And so we deem the researchers and their employees so that they can handle sensitive statistical information, and then they're subject to the Stats Act and all the requirements and penalties therein. And of course, if somebody makes a grievous error, they're not coming back to the RDC, regardless of whether the law hits them full force. So we trust them, and they know that their continued use of the RDC relies on them fulfilling their confidentiality obligations completely. And so the data in there, it's de-identified social data. Usually we don't have much economic data in there. Some tangentially economic stuff, particularly with regard to employment and workplaces, but basically it's person-level data for the most part, which means that we can use there's a body of techniques that work very well on person data, and there's another body of techniques that are more suited to enterprise data, and by partly the way StatCan is organized, and partly because the techniques are more similar within person level than between person and economic, it makes sense to specialize them that way. And we also have some linked data that's been prepared and approved and has its own set of output guidelines and disclosure rules for the linked files. So if I have the CCHS and I have vital stats deaths and they each have their own disclosure rules, then I don't just apply the two of those. We sit down on the vetting committee and work out what rules we should take from both of them and how to take things like the linkage rate and the properties of linkage and the fact that we can now combine indirect identifiers from these two sources together and come up with rules that are crafted for that linked file. So what can you do with these? The primary purpose of the RDC is to do fairly sophisticated research, modeling, some of we do hierarchical stuff, survival curves or something that come out and smooth things that you couldn't just do from a shelf table, basically. So there are often a research project will need to do some descriptive stats and some tabulations to support the fact that the data they're putting into their model is appropriate. But the main goal of the RDC is to enable somewhat more sophisticated stuff to be done that really requires microdata. So either from a very specific domain, but usually involving some sort of model, parameter estimation, and that sort of work. So we have what's possible. What's not possible? You don't do record linkage in an RDC because we have stripped off the direct identifiers to make it harder. And if you still try, then you are breaking your agreement and you're not going back in the RDC. It is not a linkage environment. StatCan maintains quite a few linkage programs and a large social domain linkage environment that can create good quality linked files that we can then assess, treat, place in the RDCs in an organized manner with their own rules. But we don't want people doing an end run around that. So linkage is just not happening in the RDCs. Some people would view attacking ecologic data onto a record as a form of linkage or some sort of statistical linkage, and that's not quite, we don't put that in our definition of the linkage that is not allowed. So people will get ecologic data across a postal code and put it onto a record, but that's not quite what we're talking about. It's really linking individuals to individuals is something that we'll take responsibility for and prepare the file and de-identify it and place it in the RDCs. And we want analyses to be aggregated, and I mean most people trying to generalize up to a population are naturally inclined to do that. But sometimes there are small cells, and whereas in some cases, if you're doing an experiment on a sample and you've got that in your research plan, you might be able to release small cells. Well, there is no way you are releasing small cells corresponding to small numbers of respondents from an RDC. You're going to have to find a way to roll them up or otherwise deal with those potentially identifying cells. Yeah, so who are the researchers? So as I said, there's a proposal process. They get it approved. So it has to, a lot of the vetting and decisions are made exclusively on confidentiality, but the proposal phase is when the researcher also has to convince the subject matter people that it's a feasible project, that there's some public benefit, that it's going to work, and that they likely have the data and the sample size to make it happen. And then, so the project has to be deemed okay. The researchers have to be deemed okay, and there's effectively a security clearance done on anybody that wants to work in an RDC. And then there's an orientation including all of the carrots and sticks of working in an RDC, the relevant laws, the policies. And once they've done this, they have to sign an oath or an affirmation saying that they understood and that they're bound by all this. Researchers can be Canadian or not Canadian. In most cases, they have to be either kind of vouched for effectively by one of the 3 granting councils in Canada or by an academic institution. So we take an outside assessment of credibility in there as well. Also, federal public servants that have their clearances and that have a need to know can go into a federal RDC and do work on data in there. And researchers can work in teams. It's not just a solo activity. In fact, I think for the most part, we really encourage researchers to, even if if it's their thesis supervisor, and even if the student is going to be doing most of the work, giving the supervisor access to the RDC means that less stuff has to go into the world, and so you're controlling your risk that way. So the steps in the broad steps, there's the proposal stage where we check that everything is above board and safe, and we're content with the risks of the people in the project. And then there's a period of work in the RDC, and then there's a release where the researcher effectively makes the case that this is a good output that follows the rules, and it's up to the analysts to agree or disagree. And if they disagree, probably to go back to step 2 and guide the researcher through creating outputs that can meet the rules. Yeah. So to slice this a different way. So who's doing what? The researchers, they're on the premises working. They get to see unreleased outputs. They can see microdata as they're working with it. They drive the research. So they plan the research, they perform the analysis, they draw conclusions, they prepare the results, and they demonstrate that they've done their job. The analysts are running the RDC. They're orienting, training, giving advice to the researcher. They're verifying that the outputs follow the rules. And if the outputs follow the rules, then they get them actually physically out of the RDC. And then the clients of the researchers, so be they journal editors or thesis committees, so they unless they are on the project team, they kind of have to trust that everything's going okay inside the RDC because they don't get to go in and look. So unless they are part of the team, they have to they have to take well-documented outputs and say this is okay or not. Their job, so we had a bit of scientific merit at the beginning. Is this a feasible project? The analyst isn't charged with assessing scientific merit. They have their particular background, but they are not a sociologist, an economist, an epidemiologist, all these other things. Their job and their specialty and skills are going to include some subject matter probably, but it's mostly running the RDC. So the scientific merit of an output, we are silent on that, and we let the journal editors or thesis supervisors see to that. And that makes vetting simpler and more consistent too, which is often an important aim. I talked at the beginning where we want to have a consistent understanding of how this is supposed to work, and part of that is taking the subject matter aspects out of the vetting process to a certain extent. And journal editors also, they're going to tell us kind of what is required. And so partly at the proposal stage, making sure that an output from an RDC from this data has a decent chance of meeting the requirements of the journal. And when we're trying to negotiate an output, sometimes it helps to know whether they need certain sorts of summaries or sample sizes and how they need to be presented. And so that can be part of the output vetting process. And then once they have once the researcher has got the results out and they get them to this kind of outside scientific authority, then it's in the world. They can publish it. They can do it. It's there's some mention of the RDC, but it's the researcher's research that's going out there. So in terms of making the case, and in terms of assembling a package to go out of the RDC, your release package is going to include the outputs you want to leave the RDC. It's also going to include a form describing what the ingredients were for the output effectively, any previous releases, notes, things that the vetting analyst should know, whose project it is, what contract, due dates, things like that. And then a whole bunch of supporting documentation depending on the project. Often the proposal and contract help the analyst interpret what the results are and what some of the variables are and surveys involved. Some explanatory notes on methods, especially when they're advanced methods that not everyone may have seen. I was talking a bit about sequence index plots. That needed an explanation. Certainly the first time I saw Gini coefficient, I'm a health person, so the Gini coefficient, the first time it was nice to get a summary of that from a researcher as far as they were describing what they were doing. Often researchers will derive variables or recode them to suit their research, and so we need to know that. Often the thing that we spend the most time on in the vetting process is looking at unweighted frequency tables and other unweighted outputs to see how many respondents are involved in various parts of the research. And sometimes, even for something that isn't a tabulation, it's often helpful to look at kind of a corresponding proxy shadow tabulation to assess that there's enough respondents going into a given output. And often the source code in SAS or Stata, so that again we know not just a prose summary of how they derived the variable, but exactly where how that process was carried out. So, and that all gets stored in the RDC, recorded for posterity in case we need to know, and it helps the analyst figure out whether an output is good to go and leave the RDC. So I've talked a bunch about the vetting rules, and this is kind of your flying tour of output confidentiality. There's a bunch of different families of data that we can kind of group together. The census, having a very high sampling fraction, is its own beast. There's the census of population, which is everybody, and then there's the long form, or the NHS, depending what year you're talking about, which is a sample survey that runs between 20% and 1 in 3, depending on the year, with exceptions in certain oversampled areas. So it has its own particular rules, partly because of that very high sampling fraction. And then other sampling surveys are usually an order of magnitude or more, less, smaller sampling fractions. So they're vetted with other techniques. Administrative data, and particularly tax data, between the law around using tax data and the fact that these are, again, censuses and we can't rely on sampling or weights, there's particular ways to vet that. As I said, the linked cohorts get their own rules, often inherited from the source. The source that has the smallest sampling fraction usually drives them, but then you have to look at other aspects of the data. And special cases, which is self-explanatory. There are some strange surveys that don't quite fit into any other category, and we do custom rules for them. So what's in common is the Stats Act basically says don't do things based on small numbers of individual identifiable respondents. So, and in some cases a respondent or an entity could be a university, a police force, a building project. So in addition to individual humans and their households, these other entities sometimes get some protection under the Stats Act, and we have to implement that. We want to protect the cluster, the identities of the sampled clusters. So because a cluster can facilitate, knowing which clusters were sampled can facilitate re-identification. That's another thing that rules in a survey with a clustered design. We make sure that geography is appropriate to the sampling design and that won't reveal clusters. The one exception is the health measures survey, because we have a little caravan of 3 big white trailers and we tell people that we're setting up in a parking lot, and so it's pretty clear where the cluster of that particular site in the CHMS was, so we don't protect that as much as other clusters. And we favor the use of weights in analysis. And I know I gave you a bunch of kind of risky aspects of weights on microdata files, but when you're working at an aggregated level, in particular we have variable weights, then the weights have the nice, well, one, they make your analysis representative, and as a nice side effect, it also conceals the number of respondents that went into a given estimate. So then it's harder to do things like differencing to find small numbers of respondents. Some of the general principles, we're particularly picky about residual disclosure within a project, so that means we're avoiding things like iteration with multiple releases out of the RDC. Because a given project is going to work with the same concepts over and over again, even if we're doing different views of the same population, we want to be careful about that, and we'll look at shadow tables, we'll look at sometimes even non-response, when it's coded as not applicable, we'll look at how not applicable breaks down and how it might be correlated with other variables. So in the vetting rules, or in the vetting process, we'll address that to protect against residual disclosure. Another principle is that we write the rules down and then we try to follow them to the letter, which is important because the RDC network is a network and each one is staffed by different people, and we want that consistency both to avoid undoing each other's work and also to be fair to the researchers so that McMaster and Dalhousie are on the same footing, and all the researchers have the same chance of getting good outputs out. And also, like I was saying, analysts are generalists. They are specialized in running RDCs and in making vetting decisions and helping people create releasable outputs. So if we have small differences between different data sources that are kind of tied up in either the discipline's traditions or just that the rules were written at different times, that's something we want to avoid. We want to make sure that we're using common concepts and common methods across the program. So here are some of the rules. Often we'll twiddle the constants, and not all of them apply to every source. But minimum contributor rules: no fewer than some number of respondents can contribute to an estimate. And so we apply this to table cells, to numerators and denominators, and the complements of the numerators in proportions and ratios. Where we're excluding small populations, where there's small exclusions, often we'll apply it there as well. And if we're going to do a distribution with quantiles, we want to make sure that between each pair of quantiles released, we also have enough people in there. Minimum and maximum, depending on, like, sometimes there are a lot of people at the ends of a distribution, at the ends of the range. So often there's a ton of people at 0, and sometimes a whole bunch of people at a maximum benefit or a maximum time period. Or if somebody's spending 7 days, if it's a number of days per week or hours per day, clearly there'll be a logical cap. But where there isn't one, say in income or in age even, we want to avoid publishing the minimum and maximum values in the sample because that may give people an indication of who's in the sample. So geography rules are a fairly big proportion of our protection, especially for those clustered surveys. So we try and make sure that whatever geographic partition of the country people are using, that all of the members of the partition have multiple clusters in them, so that you're not accidentally revealing a much finer level of detail and pinpointing people just by having a geography where there's one cluster per region. So we have a minimum level of geography usually, and then we may have a zone near that where we apply a little extra rounding and a little extra restrictions on the types of analysis you can do to protect the identities of clusters. And in some cases, particularly with census and NHS, where it's a very, very flexible data set, we recognize that people are going to want to build different sorts of custom regions corresponding to all sorts of topics, be it school districts, health regions, watersheds. We want to make sure that the population in the regions, not the respondents, but the population is a decent size. And we also specify what the minimum building block is, so that people can't draw arbitrary lines. They have to effectively map. It could be dissemination areas, postal codes, CSDs, whatever that building block is. We don't let people cut through those because that's a residual disclosure waiting to happen. And then anywhere where there's postal codes anywhere nearby, in addition to any confidentiality concerns, we also have to follow the rules that let us use postal codes. Yeah, so another aspect, another knob we can turn in developing rules and in implementing them is weights. So those sampling weights I was talking about. Oftentimes we prefer, as I was saying, to have people use the sampling weights because that protects individual, or it makes it harder to identify individual respondents. In some cases, you can mix weighted and unweighted, particularly when you're modeling, and then in other cases, the risk has been deemed to be such that we really want people to work, either to choose one and stick with it, or to work weighted all the time. And typically, the richest sets, often we require people to work weighted all the time, and they can give a global sample size, but then when they drill down, it's all weighted. So rounding, we talked a bit about that. So we can apply them to counts and totals and ratios. Sometimes the ingredients in them rather than the final quantity. Sometimes we do apply rounding to these unit-free measures, but in a lot of cases we ask people to round first and then calculate proportions to a small base, often to 5 or 10 usually suffices for unweighted. And then for weighted data, it's often some function of the median weight or some quantile of the weight. And we often specify a technique for consistency's purposes, and also because we basically we have a fairly low opinion of standard rounding, so we want to encourage people towards these versions that are harder to undo, things like random rounding and controlled rounding with gconfid. And sometimes in addition, we basically blank out cells by rounding to 0 where there are small cells, which lets people deal with those small cells without collapsing too hard in certain cases. And the NHS, the National Household Survey, is an example of that. So I mean, the main purpose of, or the ideal use case of the RDC is to create these models and other kind of analytical outputs that are not just linear functions of counts. And so typically we're pretty relaxed about those, in that we want to have a minimum number of contributing respondents, and we have a variety of cases where we will vet an analogous table, particularly where the model doesn't seem to have enough degrees of freedom left over, where it might be overfit, where things are either too simple or too little noise in the model. Then we will get people to vet the table, but otherwise we give it a good look, apply a minimum sample size, and effectively assess the legitimacy of the model as a model, so that it's not masquerading, or not another output type basically dressed up as a model. So graphical outputs, typically there's another shadow version or a proxy that we can vet. And another option is to just create your graphical outputs outside the RDC. So if you're doing a color-coded map, create us a table of regions with counts and other statistics, and you can generate it using your favorite graphics package outside rather than whatever 2 or 3 versions of the graphics package happen to be available in the RDC. So we typically map that to another output, and that we know how to vet securely and vet that. We constantly bang on the point that we do not want to see your residuals or scatter plots or other things that release individuals' data, even if it's just an individual off in the corner, and effectively you're releasing 2 of their indirect identifiers. We'd rather not take the chance, and so we encourage people to work binned or smoothed, or methods that don't create individual visible dots. And also, we don't want people writing paragraphs that say one person was eaten by a bear in my mortality database. We don't want to talk about one person. We remind researchers to avoid this sort of behavior. And I was recently sitting with a paper, and we were going through with highlighters indicating where people were basing their anecdotes on the data, which you're not supposed to do. So we are paying attention to that, and we have breathe down the necks of people until they've fixed it in some cases. And also, I mean, respondents are one thing. Sampling details that are not for public consumption shouldn't be anecdotally released either. Yeah, so I had a few mini problem-solving sessions, and we're nearing the end of the day, but does anybody want to take a crack at one of these? So if somebody had a small cell sitting in their diabetes diagnosis by municipality, what could, in an output that they're trying to get out of an RDC, what would be some of the solutions you might go to at first? Well, is it, go ahead.
Take this at the neighboring municipality.
Yeah, clustering is, or not clustering, collapsing geography is one solution. Yeah, I mean, you could, depending on the rules on the particular file of diagnosis, you might also be able to impose some rounding or ask them to model the diabetes outcome by characteristics of the municipality rather than singling out horn pain or something. So that's an option. How about somebody who's released a map with dots representing respondents? So one approach here would be, I love the word choropleth, and I have to explain it every once in a while, but it's basically shading map regions to indicate the density of something going on. So it's kind of analogous to a heat map, but for mapping purposes. So let's say we have a diagnosis of some condition by census metropolitan area with small cells all over the place, and it's a monthly data. So maybe we could go to quarterly data. Or if you've got multiple years of data, maybe you can pool all the Januaries together and so effectively kind of look at seasonal trends rather than looking at one long historical trend. Yeah, and then the last one, I kind of maybe described this one already, but if you have somebody's revised their thesis and they've added or subtracted a tiny population, ideally they revised it after having talked inside the RDC. But in this case, they've edited it out once, and now they want to vet out another version, and you can always say no, but a more defensible thing would be to look at the differences, look at the potential disclosure, and ask them to round to that degree. And they can still report their significance tests. This is important. They can report significance based on unrounded data, and then their summary tables can be rounded. So often, a lot of the treatments can be applied quite late in the game, and a p-value is a lot less disclosive than a whole table, so you can go in and work with that. So some general solutions to RDC problems. We touched upon these: collapsing categories, reducing detail, moving up the hierarchy, whether it's a digit-based code or some other hierarchy. So, NAICS codes chop off a digit. Geography, if municipalities, so CSDs, census subdivisions, aren't working for you, go up to census divisions. They're bigger. They contain more sample. You can round time, time, money, all these continuous variables. One thing we didn't touch on much is pooling of data, and some surveys are really designed for this, like the Health Measures Survey is practically designed for pooling, as it's a fairly small sample with consistent concepts over the years. And most repeated surveys can be pooled with appropriate attention to the questionnaire and to making sure the concepts are as stable as you'd like them to be. Another thing you can do is you can go from a descriptive analysis to a model. If you have enough covariates, oftentimes you can talk about relationships without needing that cross-tabulation, and you may find some more interesting stuff anyway. And the last one is you can often apply rounding to solve solve a problem, which is effectively you're adding noise in a systematic way to the data. So another set of good practices in the RDC is get everybody on the project team into the RDC. So that reduces the iteration. And that there's kind of a scale between model output and some of these less risky output, and that final three-way summary table of all of the people that went into the model. Well, save the summary table for later. So if you're tweaking your inclusions, your exclusions, then it's easier to settle on your population and then release the summary table once than to vet it out a few times and have to deal with possible residual disclosure issues. And more generally, like, what is coming out of the RDC should be pretty close to publishable. It should be something that you have a reasonable confidence that your thesis committee or your journal editor or whoever it is will find this good and defensible, and it's useful for publication. So I know, back in school we all learned to show our work, and you can document how you worked, but you don't really want to show all the intermediate data sets and things that might increase the risk, just to, unless you really need that to also show how your research happened. But so if you limit the quantity of output, you want to maximize the quality and the usefulness of what you do release, and leave the cruft inside the RDC, where it will be stored in the audit trail for however long. So if you change your mind, you may be able to get it out later if you need it. So that's the end of my talking part of the presentation, and I thought I would have a few people who helped assemble material and review the slides and material and the curriculum. I'd like to thank Vivek for inviting us here and organizing this, and the rest of the organizers of the microdata, or the data. I'm losing my ability to remember titles of things, but this day, this gathering, and of course all the errors and inconsistencies, they're me. And I want to invite Amanda up to just talk a bit about the Data Service Center, which is our regional, people who can help you with your work.
Yes, basically. This particular target may not be interested because you're more knowledgeable. If one workshop on introduction to basic statistics and your surveys from start to finish, so 1-day, 3-day workshops. We also offer webinars, free webinars. And if you're interested and you want to get on our distribution list, you can either, I can take down your contact information now, or you can just simply go on our website and click on contact us and just say, hey, sign me up for your distribution list for webinars. You can also click on our website to see what the webinars or workshops are. And we also have information sessions. Our office is located in Toronto, so it's a bit far for you to come in physically, but if one day you want to do a road trip to the provincial capital, come and see us. During information sessions, we'll put you on the distribution list. So that's our team, and that's really all I wanted to say. And if you don't mind, this is the first time we've ever done this kind of presentation. So if you do have a few moments, we would really appreciate if you could fill this out. I brought lots of pens, so if you need a pen, it would help us for any future programming.
While you do that, I'd like to thank Eric and Amanda for coming out and offer this workshop for us. I forgot to introduce Amanda in the beginning, but I sincerely thank her because she was instrumental in putting things together from the StatCan end, and get in touch with the analyst at StatCan and to bring Eric to offer this workshop for us. So really appreciable and highly grateful for you guys to come out and offer this workshop for us. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And that's what our team does. We try to, run around and try to find someone to match it up.
Yeah, and
You, I now have a new contact.
New contact, yeah. And this kind of content actually, you know, I haven't seen this kind of content, you know, so it's really rich content. And, you know, I offer services at McMaster as a DLI support, but I was, you know, unaware of, you know, so many things goes on to prepare a microdata file that are housed at RDCs. So really good content and really good presentation and workshop. Thank you.